Old School RuneScape, the medieval clicking game where no guides or content really talk about the clicking aspect. Almost every guide tells you where and when to click, assuming you have the skill to do so fast enough without making mistakes. In this guide, I am going to teach you how to click better so that you can follow all guides without fail, as well as get better XP rates when doing intense skilling methods. First, I am going to talk about mouse movement and how it applies to Old School RuneScape. Second, I will go over the two main mouse movements. I will then go over a progression of activities in Old School RuneScape that will help you get better at mouse movement organically. And finally, I'm going to talk about some mouse settings which may not seem like it at first, but are actually extremely important. Unless you have played competitive game modes in other PC games, you have probably not really heard much about mouse movement. For many PC games, including Old School RuneScape, everything pretty much relies on you having good mouse movement. Whether or not you can do a piece of content is dependent on how accurate and precise your clicks are. This means the faster you can move your mouse to click something and the more consistent you are at hitting the target, the more content you will be able to do. The better your mouse movement is, the more time you will have to think about where you need to click next. This is an extremely important concept in Old School RuneScape because all mechanics are based on clicking at the right place at the right time. Timing is everything. So how do you improve your mouse movement so that you have your mouse where it needs to be at the right time? I would argue that building muscle memory is the best way to improve mouse movement. In shooter games, this means using aim trainers where you practice a slower tracking type of mouse movement and a faster flick type of movement. Old School RuneScape uses similar but different types of mouse movement that don't really fall into these categories because it's not a shooter game. I would say you can generalize all mouse movement in Old School RuneScape into two main categories: small inventory movements and larger movements from your inventory/prayer book back to the main screen. Small inventory movements include things like gear switching in PvM and PvP, dropping items in your inventory when skilling, combo eating, and switching your prayers. It is important and easier to build muscle memory for the small inventory movements because after a small inventory movement, you will generally be clicking on the main screen immediately after. And if you mess up your inventory clicks, then your large main screen movements will suffer or have to be repeated. An amazing runelite plugin to help you with inventory movements is called anti-drag. Without this plugin turned on, it is very easy to drag items instead of equipping or using the item. This plugin essentially lets you hold down a click longer while moving your mouse before an item is dragged. I highly recommend playing around with this setting to see what works best for you. The other thing I recommend is increasing your HUD size, aka your inventory and prayer size. There are multiple ways you can do this. The way I do it is with the stretch mode plugin on runelite. This allows you to increase your HUD size to whatever you prefer, but essentially by increasing the HUD size you are giving yourself a bigger target to click. This also means you have to move your mouse further, so it just depends on your preference. If you play in a fixed mode client, stretch mode will simply take your small screen and stretch it to fit the full screen, keeping the proportions the same. With your client set up the way you want it, now how do you go about actually practicing small inventory movements? Well, I recommend practicing this motion right here. It is the motion that many good PKers and PVMers use. You can also use a motion sort of like this, but the first motion feels a lot more natural to me. No matter which one of these motions you start with, mastering one of them will help you with the other. Now, depending on the activity you are doing, you are going to want to be clicking the same area in your inventory to build muscle memory. For a gear switch, you're going to want your gear on the side of your inventory or the top of your inventory. I recommend starting to practice with a 4-click motion. The 4-click motion can then be repeated for an 8-click motion or even throughout your entire inventory depending on the activity that you are doing. I will give you more examples of how to practice this motion later in the video, but first let's talk about a more complicated motion, which is large screen movements. These movements occur in PvM when a boss changes phases or attack styles and you need to either change your prayer or switch your gear. This movement is a combination of both flicking and tracking movements from shooter games. Unlike small inventory movements, there is no set motion to practice. It is simply moving back and forth from your inventory area to the main screen and back again. It is easiest to click the areas that are adjacent to your inventory and hardest to click the areas that are on the opposite side of your screen. But after you master small inventory movements, pretty much the rest of content in Old School RuneScape will help you improve your large main screen movements over time. So how can you get better at these types of mouse movements while having fun in Old School RuneScape? Old School RuneScape is a game, and you don't need to be out here doing boring stuff to get better at a game. You just need to be intentional about building muscle memory while doing activities that you think are fun. You also need to consider that you are trying to build muscle memory, and so it is ideal to do this in low stress situations, aka do content that is easier. For me, fun includes making money, going for a big drop, or having a chance at a pet. In the early stages of building my account, in order to build muscle memory for gear switches, I did barrows. This activity makes you really good money, and there is absolutely no pressure for gear switching. However, it is required when you go to kill Aram. You also have the ability to practice how much of a gear switch you use here, as you can pretty much use whatever gear you want at barrows, and it really doesn't make a difference. Depending on how you do barrows, you'll want to finish your gear switch on the run while you run to Aram's crypt. Now, there is no pressure to do this in time, but practicing finishing that switch before you stop moving will really help you get better. Aside from barrows being a really good entry level way to practice building small inventory movements, another way is when you are skilling. Say if you're fly fishing and you get a full inventory and plan on dropping your items, you can test yourself to try and drop the items as fast as possible. Power mining is another great way to practice both inventory and larger movements, and under absolutely no stress at all. But skilling to me is boring. My progression at improving my most movement was barrows, Grotesque Guardians, Sarachnis, and Vorkath. At Grotesque Guardians, you need to do a range gear switch. I recommend doing something like a 4-way switch and then progressing to a 5 or 6-way switch. There isn't really any pressure to switch your gear in this fight, but the faster you do it, the faster your kills will be, and the longer your trips will be. At Sarachnis, you need to switch between Protect from melee and Protect from range while clicking on Sarachnis each time he webs you. If you miss the prayer switch, his max hit is 31, so it's really not a big deal. The undead spawn phase of Vorkath is another great way to practice large movements, but there's a little bit more pressure not to miss here, so I recommend trying out Sarachnis first to start getting large movements down. The route I took are all great options, but honestly, one of the best bosses to practice getting better mechanically is the new Phantom Muspah. After you get a pretty good feel for inventory movements and larger main screen movements, I recommend trying to kill the Muspah with a mage switch. Not only will you get better at most movement, but the Muspah can teach you a lot about pathing. After you have done all these pieces of content, I would say the next solo boss that is a great practice for the main types of mouse movement is the Gauntlet. The Gauntlet is a very challenging piece of content, but is very attainable if you have good mouse movement. Start with the original Gauntlet and then move on to the Corrupted Gauntlet. Having quick inventory movements to drop items quickly is a huge advantage during prep and sticky situations. Fighting the Hunlif is a prime example of how important mouse movement is to the game of Old School RuneScape. If you have good muscle memory built in for large main screen movements, then you can spend more time in this fight looking for where you need to click in order to avoid the lava, the tornadoes, and pay more attention to Hunlif's visual cues when he changes his attack style. And when you see him change his attack style, you then need to be quick to change your prayer while continuing to pay attention to your movement. If you get 50 KC at the Corrupted Gauntlet, I am pretty confident that you will have the most movement skills to follow any guide and do any content in Old School RuneScape. You will still need to spend time learning each piece of content that you want to do so that you know where you need to be clicking and when. The better your mouse movement is and your general understanding of RuneScape mechanics, then the shorter and shorter the learning process will become for whenever you try to learn a new piece of content. If you have ever tried to learn a piece of content and you're like, nah, I will never be able to do that, then it is probably due to your lack of mouse movement skills or internet/equipment issues. And while I can't help you if you have bad internet, let's talk about your mouse and mouse settings. RuneScape is not some intense game, so you really don't need a fancy mouse. However, I still recommend getting a gaming mouse of some sort simply because you can get them at pretty much the same price as an office mouse, and they're just way more consistent. I bought this Red Dragon mouse off Amazon for $30 2 years ago. I gamed hard on it on Fortnite and Apex, and I have never had a single issue with it. But regardless of your mouse, it is super important to consider your mouse settings, especially on a Windows computer. I highly recommend turning off this mouse acceleration setting. Mouse acceleration basically just adds a variable of speed when considering how your cursor moves on your screen. With mouse acceleration turned off, you only have to build muscle memory for how you move your mouse towards X and Y, regardless of the speed you move it. With mouse acceleration turned on, it considers how you move your mouse towards X and Y and the speed at which you are moving it. So for short movements, your cursor will move slower, but for larger movements, it will move much faster. Because on average, you move your mouse slower when you're trying to move your mouse a short distance, and for a large distance, you're likely to move it faster. This still comes down to preference, but I promise you that it is just much easier to learn and become way more consistent with mouse acceleration turned off. The last thing you need to consider is your mouse sensitivity, and this is also all based on preference. I think for RuneScape, I use something like a 600 DPI, but the Red Dragon app also has this weird speed thing, so I'm not really sure how that factors into the sensitivity. But yeah, even without a gaming mouse, you can adjust your cursor speed and play around with it to whatever you like. Try leaving it at a single speed to learn and build muscle memory, and after you build good muscle memory and you feel it would be beneficial to make it faster or slower, then do it. Do whatever feels good for you, it really doesn't matter. But keeping it at a single speed for a long time will help you build more consistent muscle memory. Mouse movement is a fundamental part of Old School RuneScape, and just being conscious and aware about how you can get better at mouse movement will make you a better player, even if you don't practice or do any of the progression steps I lay out in this video. Just being aware that mouse movement is important will help you do the content you never thought you could. If you have any questions, feel free to fire them my way, and if you like this video, I'm going to be making some more PVM guides that reference different mouse movements in different PVM scenarios, so be sure to check them out. I hope you're having a great day.